Welcome everyone to this conference entitled Neoliberalism and Democracy in Contemporary Africa. So my name is Loïc Chalavon and I will be the moderator during this conference. So to deal with the subject of the conference, I have the pleasure to introduce Jonathan Murphy, who is a senior lecturer in international management at Cardiff University. He also serves as chief technical advisor for the United Nations Development Program in Tunisia to support the democratic transition in the country. During this presentation, Mr. Murphy will mainly speak about the paradoxical relationship between neoliberalism and democracy in Africa. And his reflections will be based on the Tunisian democratic transition. And he will also question the links between economic and political liberalism during this presentation. So, as it was already mentioned, the presentation will last 40 minutes, and then there will be 15 minutes of questions. I now let Mr. Murphy do his presentation, and I hope you will enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Okay, merci beaucoup. Comme on a dit, je vais parler en anglais, mais je suis tout à fait ouvert à des questions en français fin de la session. Et je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre présence. And I'm particularly happy to be here, to have been invited to what is for me a really amazing collection of different topics and different scholars and different disciplines talking about geopolitics. It's a really wonderful event. I'm going to talk, as Loïc mentioned, about what I describe as the paradoxical relationship between neoliberalism and democracy. And as he also mentioned, this is based to a significant extent on the work that I did over 3 years from 2012 to 2015, running a large United Nations program of support to the democratic transition in Tunisia, and also linked with my longer-term academic research, particularly into the role of into the role of international financial institutions in the developing world, and also in relation to democracy in particular. I've worked in numerous different countries on different democratic development projects. The Tunisian example was a particularly interesting one, of course, because it was the country that launched the Arab Spring and has had so far the most successful of the democratic transitions in the Arab region, but again, with a number of different issues and problems. So what are the things that I'm going to talk about? I'm going to really focus on what I consider the uneasy relationship between neoliberalism and democracy, and to start to question whether neoliberalism imposes limits on political freedom that have a tendency to undermine social stability and to foster extremism. The presentation is going to start with a very brief background to the Tunisian revolution. Many of you might be familiar with a little bit of the background, but I'll just go over quickly some of the key events leading up to the Tunisian revolution. Then I'm going to look a little bit more generally at arguments about whether economic liberalism and political liberalism are natural allies, which is the fundamental question that we're trying to look at in the presentation. I'll look then back to Tunisia, talk about Tunisia under Ben Ali before the revolution of 2011. Then look at the role of the World Bank as a leading institution representing economic liberalism, or more appropriately neoliberalism, and its role within Tunisia. Then look at the impact of neoliberalism on countries of the South, and particularly on Tunisia, and whether neoliberalism results in the creation of what some authors have described as a precariat, a new youth proletariat that represents a threat to social stability, and then look more broadly at the end in terms of neoliberalism and politics in the periphery, the peripheral areas of the advanced capitalist economies. So to start, as most people know, there is a long-standing problematic of democracy in the Arab region. It's a region that has been severely marked, damaged by colonialism. And after independence, in most countries in the Arab region, regimes were replaced, the colonial regimes were replaced by authoritarian statist regimes. In terms of the support of the international community, and particularly international financial institutions, up until the mid-70s to the early 80s, the international financial institutions tended to support the state-driven development approach that most post-independent countries, independence countries in the Arab region, and particularly in the Maghreb, followed after independence. But from the 1980s, with the rise of neoliberal thinking and its domination in the macroeconomic field, international financial institutions started to pressure for structural adjustment. Structural adjustment, as you know, meaning programs of privatization, of marketization, of opening up the state or opening up the economy to foreign investment, and emphasis on competitive advantage rather than the previous policy of building up national strategic industries. The adoption of structural adjustment in the Arab region, as in some other parts of the world, was resisted for a number of years. And in fact, several countries in the Arab region were able to resist structural adjustment for quite a long time, particularly I think of Algeria, which was able, with resource revenues, to compensate economic slowdown and was not in need of the financial support of international financial institutions. However, Tunisia, which is relatively resource poor, Tunisia has very, very small oil reserves. Its only world-class resource base is in phosphates, was in a position where the government felt obliged to adopt neoliberal reforms quite early on after they became the favorite recipe of the international financial institutions. And actually quite quickly, the adoption of neoliberal reforms, particularly the removal of subsidies on foodstuffs, created social tensions within Tunisia. There were growing manifestations of dissent towards the regime, particularly bread riots in 1984 under the leadership of the then elderly Habib Bourguiba, who had led the country to independence. In fact, those bread riots had a role in weakening Bourguiba's control on power, and a couple of years later he was replaced by Ben Ali, who had been briefly his prime minister, but was largely had come to fame as the head of the security apparatus in the Tunisian state. Ben Ali kept a lid on protests until the early 2000s, and most notably in the run-up to the 2011 revolution, there was a major uprising of the mining region around Gafsa in south-central Tunisia that led to, or that resulted in, the government murder of a number of protesters, number that's still not known. And as most people will remember, the revolution of 2010-2011 was triggered by the self-immolation of a young vegetable vendor who was protesting or felt that he had been mistreated by authorities. The exact story has gone into mythology, but it's a mythology that is definitely held very close to heart by Tunisian citizens, and particularly by young Tunisians. So that's a little bit of the context. So now let's move a little bit to look at the relationship between economic and political liberalism. There has been a common assumption, and I think there is still in many quarters, an assumption that liberal democracy and free market capitalism are closely connected, if not inseparable. That political freedom is required for economic freedom, and economic freedom is required for political freedom. And this perhaps could be encapsulated a little bit by the idea of the American dream. But when we look a little bit more closely at what the originators of the theory of free markets believed, it perhaps wasn't quite as simple and straightforward as current representations of the connection between economic and political liberalism might seem. So Adam Smith, for example, believed that the operation of the free market would result in relatively egalitarian, relatively equal wealth distribution. He said that in developed countries, the rate of profit does not, like rent and wages, rise with prosperity and fall with the declension of the society. On the contrary, the rate of profit is naturally low in rich countries and high in poor countries. Smith's free market belief was underpinned by a number of preconditions, which included, for example, labor legislation, inheritance tax, restrictions on rentier capitalism, and restrictions on market manipulation. So if you think about it, many of the different features that are seen in authoritarian capitalist regimes that still are following the edicts of institutions like the World Bank do not fit with what Adam Smith's vision was of a free market economy. Nevertheless, many current development economists, very respected people like William Easterly, argue that broad-based economic opportunity requires both functioning markets and democratic freedoms. So this debate, this thinking about this issue continues. I want to look then back at how do these ideas about free market economy and democracy translate into today's development theory, development thinking, and today's thinking about democratic development. One key change from the era of Adam Smith is the emergence and the subsequent domination of the limited liability company. And in the view of one of I consider the great thinkers, Marie-Laure Jellick, who is at ESSEC in Paris, that the limited liability company created a moral hazard that has come to overshadow both economy and politics. And within neoliberal think tanks such as the Mont Pelerin Society, which groups together or grouped together most of the thinkers who pushed neoliberal ideas to the fore from the 1950s through to the 1980s, there was a big debate in the early years between classical liberals who, like Adam Smith, were concerned about monopolies, were concerned about the role of untrammeled limited liability corporations, and a more overtly political and a more pro-major corporation stance. And it was the pro-major corporation, the pro-limited liability corporation people who won that debate. And coming out of that debate, how does that fit with the situation in Tunisia, the support of international financial institutions for a regime like the Ben Ali regime before the revolution? Well, from the 1970s, neoliberals tended to shift their concerns from opening up markets, from the creation of free markets, to having an impact on global economic governance. So rather than focusing on how do we have free markets, it was how can we ensure that there is global economic governance that fits the needs of major corporations. And as a result, the political power of large corporations is strongly reflected in the rules underpinning the globalized economic system and in its governance institutions. And one example from a different part of the world that demonstrates this quite important connection between neoliberal economics and a particular kind of political regime was the engagement of leading Chicago school economists, including Milton Friedman, in redesigning the Chilean economy on a pro-capitalist, on a so-called free market basis after the military coup of 1973. And in fact, the finance ministry in the Pinochet military dictatorship was dominated by a group of people called the Chicago Boys. It was young Chileans who had studied at Chicago and were carrying the neoliberal ideas from there to implement in the situation of the dictatorship, the authoritarian dictatorship after the coup. Concerns about the way in which neoliberalism has become associated in developing contexts with authoritarian or even criminalized regimes have been raised from the 1990s onwards. For example, Beatrice Ibu talked about the emergence of the criminalized state in Africa as a product of neoliberalization mandated by international financial institutions and carried out under autocratic rule. Let's then, from that broad view of the argument about economic democracy, economic liberalism, political democracy, political liberalism, then looking at the changing and much more politicized view of neoliberal thinkers from the 60s through to the 70s, the impact of those thinkers on international financial institutions such as the World Bank, and now back to Tunisia, just briefly looking at the relationship between international financial institutions and the Ben Ali regime. And we find that the Ben Ali regime, which came to power in 1987, operated in very close symbiosis with international financial institutions. And for example, a recent commentary on the Ben Ali regime said, à l'époque, gouverner le macroéconomique, c'était tout d'abord légitimer le régime autoritaire en adéquation avec les injonctions internationales. Et cela consistait en un savant contrôle des statistiques, louant la croissance, occultant les chiffres de chômage et vantant le miracle économique. So the Ben Ali regime, in a way, perhaps fraudulently, but with the explicit support of international financial institutions, emphasized its neoliberal credentials. And in return, international financial institutions were very happy to laud Tunisia on its economic successes. I don't have a quote from this particular piece, but the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, for example, compared Tunisia just before the 2011 revolution as North Africa's equivalent of the Chinese economic success story. And from a paper, a brief of the World Bank that it issued only 3 months before the revolution, they said Tunisia has made remarkable progress on equitable growth, fighting poverty, and achieving good social indicators, and that Tunisia is far ahead in terms of government effectiveness, rule of law, control of corruption and regulatory quality. For the Tunisians who went out on the streets a few weeks later and burned down the various palaces done in exquisitely bad taste by the Ben Ali family, the idea that the regime was strong on corruption might have been a bit of a surprise. So what did the World Bank do after having held hands really with the regime up until virtually the day of the revolution? Well, as you might imagine, for the first year after the revolution, the World Bank in Tunisia kept quite a low profile, although they did spend quite a bit of time removing the rhetoric that they had published just the year before regarding Ben Ali's Tunisia from their webpage. And it now requires quite a bit of deep searching to find that documentation in their website. But on July the 12th, 2012, so about a year and a half after the revolution, the bank re-emerged with a new headline on their webpage saying, "We're here." In 2011, Tunisian citizens demanded voice and accountability. The bank is supporting Tunisia's transition with a focus on jobs, economic recovery, and inclusion. So what appeared to be a complete 180-degree turnaround in terms of the perspective of the bank. And the bank followed this with what I considered a stunning report that they issued in 2014 called All in the Family, which turned its previous support for Ben Ali on its head, arguing that in fact the Ben Ali Trabelsi, that was Ben Ali's wife, that their clique had managed to capture over 20% of national private sector profit. But at the same time arguing that the problem in Tunisia, the reason for the abuse by the Ben Ali regime, which remember only a year before it had been saying was doing a fantastic job dealing with corruption, was insufficient liberalization, insufficient privatization, and insufficient marketization. And the solution to the economic challenges of Tunisia was to do more of the privatization, marketization, liberalization. And they followed this report with really an extensive social media campaign. They produced 2 more major reports which had very, very specific recommendations in terms of what needed to be done for neoliberal restructuring of the economy. One called The Unfinished Revolution. So the second part of the revolution was going to be more liberalization. And the second major report issued in 2014 called Advancing Tunisia's Global Integration. So a very, very strong emphasis on free trade. This sleight of hand, which I think en français on peut dire escamotage, yeah? Can you say that? It's a word in English apparently that I'd never heard of. Anyway, it didn't pass unnoticed in Tunisia. So one of the major sort of oppositional electronic media outlets, Nawat, published 2 critical articles, and the Alternative Economists Association, Observatoire Tunisien de l'Économie, published social media commentaries that were widely shared. The main point of view that was being put forward was that the bank was cynically attempting to identify with anti-corruption in order to justify a neoliberal restructuring. A reading of what the bank was up to that I think is probably fairly accurate. Now I want to talk about, so what is the impact of, let's try and draw perhaps some not definitive conclusions, but to raise some questions and suggestions about what is the impact of imposition of neoliberal policies, particularly in peripheral countries. And to do that, I want to use a concept that a former senior International Labour Organization official, Guy Standing, published a book that had a lot of coverage in the Anglo-Saxon world, I suspect not as much in the Francophone world, called the Precariat, the dangerous class. And he argued that the neoliberal restructuring that was occurring in Europe in particular was leading to the creation of a large class of young people with few opportunities for integration into the secure formal economy, and that this group of people, this class, he described it, was a threat to stability. And he argued for a rebalancing of the economy, if you like, a social democratization of the economy, to assure the inclusion of young people, to assure that young people would have opportunities. And his book, he published it actually just before the Arab Spring started, coincided with the 1% movement, the 1%, 99% movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Indignados in Spain, and the rise of Syriza in Greece. So the timing was very good, and I think Guy would say that it was prescient. Maybe he was right. And it was a heavily reported book, both in the popular press and also has had a major influence on scholarly literature with thousands of Google Scholar citations to date. And Standing's focus on this exclusion of youth corresponds with growing attention to the structural weaknesses of the global neoliberal economy, reflected in the popularity of studies like Piketty's Capital in the 21st century and the rise to prominence of critical US economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman. Standing was criticized, as every scholar is, but on two grounds in particular. One, in terms of the weakness of his class analysis. He claimed to be presenting a neo-Marxist analysis, and some people argue that it didn't fulfill, the Precariat doesn't fulfill the Marxist criteria for class. I'm going to leave that aside. But he was also criticized for paying insufficient attention to the situation of the Precariat in the South. So he talked almost exclusively about the European so-called Precariat. And one particular development thinker, Ronaldo Monk, who's in Ireland, but with Latin American origins, argued that in fact in the periphery, youth have lived in conditions of precarity for a long time, and that therefore the idea that this precariat is a new thing is a very sort of Western obsessed idea. And I think that Monk is correct that Standing should not just have talked about Western Europe, but in my view, his critique or his understanding of this creation of a precariat is perhaps even more appropriate for countries of the global South. His observation of the growing chasm between young citizens and the neoliberal economy and the state seems to me at least as pertinent in areas outside the capitalist core countries, and particularly in countries peripheral to the world economy, or to the central economies of the world economy, than it is in the countries of the global north. And in fact, we see, of course, that the precariat, the emergence of the precariat, has occurred with the greatest bang, if you like, in countries on the edge of the European Union project. So, for example, Spain and Greece, countries with levels of youth unemployment approaching 50%. And in fact, with conditions that are starting to become comparable to the situation in many emerging and developing economies. And in fact, youth in Africa and in many parts of the European neighborhood, both the European neighborhood on the southern banks of the Mediterranean and east of the European Union, have been subject to an extreme form of precarity since the advent of structural adjustment 40 years ago. So I'm saying the argument that Standing uses can be very, very, very well applied as an explanation, or one explanation, of the growing instability that was manifested in the Arab Spring, and particularly with the Tunisian Revolution. And so the Tunisian Revolution can be justifiably described as a movement led by the Tunisian Precariat, a large population of educated youth with few or no opportunities. So then let's look at, so the Tunisian Revolution is one outcome of this creation of a southern precariat. What about the question of whether jihadism perhaps represents to some extent the rebellion of a southern precariat? There's a lot of study nowadays, of course, about the social origins and motivations of individuals associated with terrorist attacks in Europe, attacks that are largely perpetrated by European citizens. And these studies find a close link between a sense of social exclusion and radicalization. Several studies suggest that per capita, Tunisia has provided more recruits to the Islamic State than any other country. In fact, though, there are surprisingly few ethnographic studies of the North African Precariat, but a notable example is a recent study by somebody, a Franco-Tunisian scholar who's based in Tunisia, Olfa Lamloum, on the youth of two quartiers populaires in Tunis. And this study confirms a strong appeal of jihadism amongst youth of these quartiers, closely tied to a sense of exclusion both within Tunisia and as Muslims of the southern banks of the Mediterranean. In my view, the sense of economic exclusion is an important component of exclusion that cannot be unpicked from sentiments of social and cultural exclusion. And both my own observations and studies like Lamloum's study show that there's a very strong sense of disappointment amongst Tunisian youth of all social origins regarding the economic and often the political outcome of the Tunisian Revolution, which is often seen as having been subverted into a relatively narrow elite compact, permitting the Islamist Ennahda leadership to be incorporated into a reformed post-Bourguiba political elite. So now, reaching towards the end, to try and tie all this stuff together, what are the implications then of neoliberalism on politics in the periphery? As we've seen, the World Bank and the Ben Ali regime had a mutually supportive relationship. The kleptocratic nature of the regime didn't bother the international financial institutions until after it fell. And that, I think, underlines the primacy in neoliberal thinking of economic governance over democratic content. In fact, there's a long history of support to authoritarian regimes by international financial institutions. I give a couple of examples there. And what's interesting is that the international financial institutions were even a little bit out on a limb compared with the broader diplomatic community in Tunisia. And the WikiLeaks tapes, which had an impact on the Tunisian revolution, because they recounted the points of view of US diplomats in Tunisia, had several years before the revolution identified the corruption of the regime as a major risk to stability and had recommended that the American government distance itself from the Ben Ali regime. So even while political diplomacy was saying, hey, this is not going very well, there's an explosion that's going to happen, the international financial institutions, the neoliberal institutions, kept pushing forward with support for this authoritarian form of neoliberalism. And I would add More recently, since October 2015, the European Union and Tunisia are negotiating a so-called deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. And again, that demonstrates the determination of Tunisia's largest economic partner to privilege neoliberal economic restructuring over social stability in Tunisia. So the European Union has been quite aggressive, again, in pushing for the very rapid opening of the Tunisian economy to European imports, meanwhile maintaining European tariffs on Tunisian agricultural exports. And in all likelihood, if that free trade agreement is agreed, is signed on the basis of what the European Union wants, increasing social instability and support for extremism within Tunisia. So this inconsistency between a rhetorical support for democratic transition and in reality a support for economic policies that are going to undermine social stability is a continuing feature of the behavior not just of the international financial institutions but also of the European Union. So where next for democracy and global neoliberalism? So there's a traditional leftist critique of democracy as being merely a flip side of neoliberalism. So there's a book by Robinson in 1996 where he basically says, well, liberal democracy and neoliberalism, it's all the same thing. For me, the example of Tunisia and the behavior of the international financial institutions prior to and subsequent to the 2011 revolution undermines this argument. In fact, at best, the international financial institutions are what one of their officials described as agnostic towards democracy. For these institutions, neoliberalism above all, and if democracy can aid the implantation of neoliberal economic policies, all the well, but if autocracy can do a better job of it, then autocracy it shall be. There is, at the same time, I believe, a continuing evidence of strong popular desire for democracy. Not only the spread of the Arab Spring revolutions across the Arab region, but we've also seen, as has been discussed several times at this conference, effective movements to force overstaying presidents from power in Senegal, the removal of Blaise Compaoré in Burkina Faso, and continuing contestation in Burundi. But at the same time, the rise of jihadism and the equally disturbing rise of xenophobic movements across the West demonstrates to me that democracy is not the only alternative to imposed neoliberalism. And in fact, I don't think I'm exaggerating too much in saying that there are quite considerable similarities to the situation today as there were to the situation in the 1930s. The problem with democratic transition under a global neoliberal regime is the determination of the Western-dominated institutions to prioritize neoliberal economics over any definition of democracy that could challenge the social exclusion that itself destabilizes peripheral countries where a large majority of the population doesn't benefit from neoliberalism. And to conclude, perhaps not in a terribly positive light, further instability, including continuing support for nihilistic movements like the Islamic State, can be anticipated, while an economic model that delivers a growing gap between the included and the excluded, the core and the periphery, is dominant. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murphy, for your presentation. It is now time for questions, so feel free to ask all questions that you want, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Hi, Mr. Murphy. I'd like to ask you about your conclusion. It's not a very hopeful one, and I wanted you to maybe give us more insight into what you actually, maybe detail it a bit and say how, in your view, this is going to play out with the Islamic State and this economic model you think creates haves and have-nots. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I think, as I had said, I gave an example of the study on the attitudes of youth of the Quartier Populaire in Tunis towards extremism, and many examples of youth who are not necessarily religious à fond, but sitting around in cafes across the Maghrebian region thinking, you know, nothing to do, unemployed, no opportunity, no chance of getting to Europe. Let's do something that is going to make a splash. And I think that I wouldn't say that the Islamic State is entirely a reflection of that, but I would say both within the Maghrebian region or within the periphery of Europe and also within peripheral communities inside Europe, that sense of exclusion, that sense of being an outsider is a fundamental, if not the most important motivator to what is called extremism, but it's really this going out in a splash, going out in a bang. The recent terrorist attack, I saw reports saying that the perpetrators had spent the afternoon in the bar before they'd gone and shot up some people. The fellow who was captured in Brussels yesterday had been convicted for small-time petty criminal activities and ran a cafe that was known as a place where drugs were sold. This is not people who have spent a lot of time studying holy books. This is people who feel themselves on the edge, on the outside, who feel that they are excluded from a political system, and a lot more attention needs to be given to inclusion. That's not saying that the actions need to be justified, but we need to be intelligent and rational in terms of how we respond to this threat.
Merci, Monsieur Murphy, pour votre présentation. So I have some questions for you. You have used very stimulating references and authors and theories. So I would like to go back on the theory and to discuss the explanation, not in the way to talk about culturalist arguments, but to talk about les pratiques, les modes de vie, les habitus, all the... Je vais continuer en français. Les modalités d'une société, tout ce qui crée le lien social dans des sociétés comme les sociétés du sud de l'Europe, la Grèce, l'Espagne, le Portugal, l'Italie, qui ont leurs caractéristiques propres et qui sont justement dans le paradigme néolibéral ne conviendraient pas en fait à ces sociétés. Et donc ma question serait, est-ce qu'on peut aborder aussi les limites du néolibéralisme en tant que paradigme dans des sociétés par une explication qui ne serait pas culturaliste, mais qui recenserait ces pratiques, ces modes de vie, et qui permettrait de comprendre pourquoi est-ce que le néolibéralisme ne fonctionne pas. Merci.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. I think that I'm not qualified to talk about whether neoliberalism is culturally suitable for countries of Southern Europe or countries of the southern bank of the Mediterranean. My main concern, but I'm not excluding that might be the case, but it's just not something I have any expertise on at all. And as you said, I think we've got to be cautious about culturalist arguments, about going too far in that direction without really knowing what we're talking about. My thinking is more that it's a question of economic exclusion. My thinking is more that the unemployment rate in Spain amongst youth is 50%. The unemployment rate in Tunisia amongst youth is 50%. Tunisia is quite a bit poorer than Spain. I think we might expect perhaps a more hopeless sense in Tunisia, particularly when you add the sense of being treated as the other, being physically excluded from Europe. But I would draw some parallels between the Indignados movement in Spain and both the revolution in Tunisia and the emergence of extremism. I think that they're all a sense that people are excluded. So I see that exclusion being primarily, I shouldn't say primarily, I see that exclusion being a combination of economic, political, and cultural exclusion. And I think where you have the situation on the southern bank of the Mediterranean, where it's not just economic exclusion, but it's physical exclusion from Europe, and it's also being described continuously as the other. I think that the relative ferocity of the kickback in those regions is understandable more from that basis than from the characteristics of people who live in that area. It's more the relationship between people in that area and people in the core countries of the north. Spain has done very badly economically on the whole, but at the same time, Spanish people still have the freedom of movement throughout Europe, for example. And they are not treated as the other with a capital O. So that would be my preferred response, but there are people who are much more expert on culture than me who could talk about that.
Mr. Murphy, thank you for your analysis. I saw that you put your focus on Tunisia because that's a country that you know best. But I'm trying to draw a parallel and ask one questions in three or three questions in one about neoliberalism. Isn't the problem of the lack of accuracy from the World Bank? I have family working in the World Bank, but some people probably make their analysis from the outside, not knowing the inside. So the analysis about Tunisia, just as if people were like drawing conclusions from the outside and thinking Tunisia is a good place to be or to go or to invest. And then again, when it comes to democracy, is the Western democracy the right pattern for developing country, emerging countries, ignoring their cultural history or biases? And today, corruption happens to be the utmost neoliberalism problem. Is that the case? Is it neoliberalism the problem? Is it corruption? Is it democracy? Is it the lack of accuracy when you're lending money to countries and they're not, you know that they're actually not developing, even if you have fake numbers. If you go on the field, then you know that the money is not spent accurately. So what do you think?
Well, I think there's lots of good people who work for the World Bank, including your family. And I worked for the World Bank myself before, so I know there's lots of good people that used to work there, hopefully me. But I think but I think that the problem with the World Bank is that it focuses on a particular model. So no matter what the situation is, it's like a doctor that if you go in to see the doctor, no matter what your symptoms are, you're going to get the same medication. And the medication is always exactly the same. The medication is neoliberalism. I suppose I feel on your argument about whether democracy is suited to people of the global south. Yeah. I mean, there was a discussion about that at the big session earlier this afternoon. I mean, to me, democracy, of course, can exist in many different forms, but I have difficulty seeing the regime of Ben Ali as reflecting any form of democracy. And I think that there's an underestimation of the extent to which democratic ideas are anchored in the global south. I mean, we talk about the origins of democracy being ancient Greece, but in fact, there are examples of democracy from the Nubian civilization in Africa, which predate ancient Greece. There are examples of democracy from Mesopotamia that predate ancient Greece. And so I tend to not be that sympathetic to the view of democracy being a cultural imposition of the West. What I do think is that what perhaps I didn't get through as clearly as possible is that what I think is that the West has a tendency to support democratization as long as some of the basic rules which permit the economic domination of the West go unchallenged. And as soon as those rules are challenged, then there's a lot less enthusiasm about democracy from the point of view of the West. So I suppose I would argue there's a certain amount of hypocrisy in the West, in that the support for is democracy as we like the outcomes. That's more the way I look at it.
Good afternoon. I have a question because I come from Africa. And when you talk about neoliberalism and democracy in Africa, what I don't understand is that why is it that the World Bank and international financial institutions always take decisions for African countries? Because when you talk about poverty, you say African countries are poor because their leaders are very bad leaders. Of course, we have foolish leaders sometimes in some countries. But if they don't give us the opportunity to define our own economic policies, how can they talk about development in Africa? Why is it that the orders always come from above, from Washington, from London, from Paris, and they don't give us the opportunity to define our own economic problems? I don't understand that. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I guess I agree with you completely. So I think the international financial institutions reflect a new phase of the domination and control of northern countries over the global economy. It's a smoother and more sophisticated, and in some ways a more inclusive process than colonialism was. But let's not forget, like, how are votes determined at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund? The great majority of shares, and in other words, the power of economic decisions, is held by the same countries. It's held by the United States. The United States has the biggest share and has a blocking share in both institutions, so no major decisions can be made without the support of the US. And then after the US, it's Japan, the UK, France. It's the same powers. And so I think naturally the decisions of the World Bank, not because anybody is a bad person or anybody wants to do bad, but because people automatically reflect their own thinking, their own cultural biases, I think, and will have a tendency to perceive the problems of Africa as being problems of the other that can be solved. And I think it's just a continuation, to be honest, of a colonial form of thinking.
Yes, another question for you, Mr. So we have discussed the bad face, I would say, of neoliberalism, but I think I understood from your presentation that financial institutions contributed to the continuation of revolution in Tunisia. Is that what you wanted to mean?
J'ai pas tout à fait compris votre question. Si vous pouvez répéter en français.
Pas de problème. Donc, j'ai cru comprendre dans votre exposé qu'à un certain moment, vous nous avez parlé d'une sorte de rôle des institutions financières internationales dans l'appui de la révolution en Tunisie, à travers le titre qui était indiqué. Et donc, j'aimerais savoir si on ne pourrait pas identifier là un pouvoir des institutions financières internationales, comme on le discutait dans les précédentes questions, mais qui serait plutôt positif, qui ne serait pas un pouvoir de contrainte.
Oui, en effet, peut-être je me suis mal exprimé, parce que ce que j'ai voulu dire, c'était que jusqu'au moment de la Révolution, la Banque mondiale était à 100% derrière le régime Ben Ali. Après la chute du régime pendant un an, la banque a peu dit, n'a pas exprimé grand-chose. Après un an, ils ont dit, oui, la révolution était une bonne chose et ce qu'il faut faire, c'est d'élargir le champ de privatisation, le champ de néolibéralisme. Où, à mon avis, c'était en effet la mise en œuvre de néolibéralisme sous le régime autoritaire de Ben Ali qui a créé la condition pour la révolution. C'est-à-dire que la Banque mondiale insiste maintenant de répéter l'exemple qui a mené la Tunisie à une révolution. Et pour moi, bon, on a eu une révolution. Je pense que ça serait mieux en Tunisie d'essayer de garder la paix sociale et de développer le pays sans insister sur des réformes plutôt idéologiques qui vont miner la stabilité sociale. Je ne dirais pas, peut-être je me suis mal exprimé en anglais.
Donc cela c'est par volonté politique ou par opportunisme économique?
I think there was a certain amount of opportunism. I can't believe that the World Bank didn't realize that they had supported Ben Ali. I think they knew they had, and after the revolution they thought, well, how can we continue? But I think what to them is important, what the example demonstrates is that what is critically important is no matter who is in control, no matter who's in power, under whatever rubric, democratic, authoritarian, whatever you want, the most important thing is that you follow neoliberal economic policies. And what I'm saying is, I think actually neoliberal economic policies are one of the major causes of social instability, both in Europe and perhaps even more so in countries peripheral to Europe, and I suspect have a substantial impact, are a substantial cause for the emergence of various types of nihilistic opposition, which all the people of Europe and the world are now confronting.
Dernière question ici.
Sorry, I'm coming back again. Fingers crossed you keep your job at the World Bank.
No, I say I used to work
Oh,
at the
you
World
used
Bank.
to.
No.
Okay, no problem.
Although when I quit, I was a bit critical of the bank, and they said they would never hire me again. But then a few years later, they hired me. So again,
yeah, I know what you're talking about. I'm
so
a
you
consultant
can get away
myself.
with stuff.
One last question about the lack of accuracy. Could you tell me if I'm wrong or not? Wasn't the IMF structural adjustment program one of the biggest mistakes in developing countries? Because some countries became poorer than the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the question of structural adjustment is a huge one, but generally speaking, I would agree with you that that structural adjustment policies they created winners and losers, but there were a lot of losers, and I think that what is not taken into account in neoliberal policies, of which structural adjustment is one example, is what is the impact on social stability of these policies. Maybe you can have a kind of unbalanced growth that possibly, I'm not an economist, possibly is greater than if you continued with more balanced social democratic type policies. Maybe under Ben Ali there was relatively high growth. But the problem was there was also an enormous gap developed between rich and poor, and a sense of great injustice, because really what privatization, what neoliberalism meant, what structural adjustment meant in Tunisia was that the authoritarian regime, that Ben Ali and his family privatized state enterprises and put the resources in their own pocket. And the population is not stupid. They saw that. Now, even if the economy grew by 4%, whereas it would have only grown by 3% a year, by doing that, the conditions for the Tunisian revolution had been created, because people don't care if the growth of GDP is 4% rather than 3%. If they don't see any of it, and the family of the ruling regime puts it all in their pocket. It's a mythical growth. It's not a growth that benefits the population, and in fact it infuriates the population, and it leads to either the positive kind of things like the overthrow of the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia, or if you like, the Indignados, the youth movements in Spain, but it can also lead to much more negative outcomes. It can lead to, if you like, extremism, the idea that this system means nothing to us, we need to blow it up. And it also leads, I think, on the other hand, amongst other disempowered people who feel themselves excluded, into supporting racism and Front National and this idea that the system doesn't work, we've got to blow it up. Who are the people who support Donald Trump? I mean, it's people who feel that the world is unfair. You don't have to agree with the solutions people come up with to see that there's some kind of a problem, there's something kind of unhealthy in the global economy at the moment. And Tunisia was just one example, but I think it occurs all over.
So it's the end of the conference. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope it helps you to better understand the relationship between neoliberalism and democracy in Africa. Thank you very much, Mr. Murphy, for your very clear presentation. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the Geopolitics Festival in GEM. And yeah, thank you very much.